Recent devastating floods in KZN and the Eastern Cape have shown a better approach is needed in dealing with such disasters. Many Durban residents say if the eThekwini municipality had given them an early warning, they might have prepared better for the floods. But climate scientist Francois Engelbrecht says there should rather be more education around climate change, as early weather warning signs are just not enough. We're joined now by Professor Francois Engelbrecht from Centurion. He is the director at the Global Change Institute at Wits University. Prof, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Obviously, we've spoken to many people, probably your colleagues in the sphere of the science that that is your field of expertise. In the weeks, the days, the weeks after those devastating floods in KZN, and there's a long list of things that should have been done, systems that need to be put in place, and the early warning system is the one that came up time and time again. But what I found interesting about the point that you're bringing across is, for me, correct me if I'm wrong, you're focusing on the human element here. It's all well and good that you've got all the gizmos and all the gadgets and all the system, the new SMS systems and that kind of thing. But what about the human element of people sitting, it's 10 o'clock at night, from the sounds of it, that's where the heavy rain started falling in the Durban area. Your kids are asleep, an SMS comes through and it says, oh, warning, there's this heavy rain that's coming. What would an average human being do with that information if they haven't been educated about what to expect and what to do next? Is that what you're hoping to put the focus on here?
Good evening, Marcel. Thanks so much for having me. Yes, that's exactly the point myself and my colleagues have been trying to make in recent weeks. In fact, the wake-up call for Southern Africa should have been the landfall of tropical cyclone Idai back in March 2019. More than 1,000 people died. Hundreds of people died the night of landfall in Beira alone. And the tragedy of this disaster in Beira, which was now repeated in KwaZulu-Natal, is that the early warnings we have from numerical weather prediction models are generally so accurate and reliable. In the case of the Beira cyclone, 3 days ahead of landfall, the forecasts were indicating that landfall is going to be right at Beira and that we are looking at potentially a Category 4 hurricane. That is what happened. And the tragedy is that all the people that are most vulnerable, that live in the informal settlements all around Beira, and that were so vulnerable for the flooding from the rivers and also the storm surge that came from the ocean, still found themselves exactly where they always are, despite of these early warnings being issued, also by the Mozambique government. So the science is well developed. My own field of speciality is in these gadgets you've mentioned, the satellite data, the climate models. It is so sad that we have all the science to protect us against these compound flood risk events, but it's the uptake of the messages, the uptake of the forecasts. That is where things are going wrong. That is the main problem we should focus on. It's all about what we call community-based disaster management. So we do need to work more with our communities on how we need to react when the early warning comes through.
I suppose I think immediately of so many Hollywood movies that have been made that basically is modeled on scientists riding across the country to try and get the attention of the leaders of the country to tell them there's this massive wave that's coming and they need to move fast, and nobody wants to believe the scientists. So many movies have been made of it, and that's exactly what you're talking about here. You and your colleagues speak about climate hazard literacy, which really, in a nutshell, just explains what is needed. It's all well and good that we're teaching our kids at school about climate change and it brings drought and it does this, that and the other, but the community-based communication, which unfortunately we've seen has been lacking in so many ways here in South Africa when it comes to big things, even during the pandemic when we needed to raise awareness when COVID-19 first hit. How would you suggest one goes about getting the information across to the people who need it most in a way that they can engage with and, most importantly, will be able to understand?
It's a shared responsibility between science on the one hand, governance structures, in the first place municipalities on the other hand, and also the communities themselves. it really should be a two-way discussion, because we as the scientists or the governors also need to understand what are the barriers that are preventing people to take up a warning. For example, it is not always clear to people where they will be housed. Where can they go, where they will be safe, where they will have clean water and food for a few days, and security. What will happen to their properties if they suddenly evacuate? Will there be security? Will their properties be looked after? So relationships of trust need to be developed between our most vulnerable communities and the municipalities in the first place. And then South Africa needs to learn, and this is really important, how to evacuate thousands of people with 1 or 2 days of warning. This is not something that we are going to get right if we don't practice how to do this, and if we don't have excellent flood risk master plans in place in many of our municipalities.
We also realize a conversation was needed about land when it comes to these kinds of issues. It's not good enough just to say, oh, you can't build your home here because it's on unequal ground, or it's where a fire is expected to come through, and the list goes on. There really needs to be education so that people understand where is the best place to be able to build, and like you said, for the municipalities to provide the basics so that they can go ahead and make a life for themselves.
This is the other side of the equation. So far we've been talking to Nout about how to manage the short-term response to an impending flood event. But we should not accept that we should always have communities that live in these absolute dangerous zones below the flood lines. Here where I live in Tshwane, there are 30,000 people living below the known current flood lines. Why is this situation not improving over time? So this is a problem far easier talked about and solved in the case of the developing African cities. Increasingly, our cities have these large informal components being added to them increasingly. So it's about offering people safe land with access to clean water, for a start, safe housing, and very importantly, access to the city and access to the job opportunities. So that also brings transport infrastructures into the equation. If you don't give people if you can't put a reasonable offering on the table, they would tend to live close to the cities and often along the big river banks where water is and where they are close to the city in order to be able to compete for the job opportunities. It's of course very expensive to implement these types of solutions. We all know in South Africa that our housing program is of course years behind schedule. But the good news is increasingly the international community under the Paris Agreement on climate change is stepping up and is making more and more funding available for climate change adaptation in the developing countries of the world. Now, we should keep an eye on the $8.5 billion US dollar just transition transaction offered to South Africa last year around the 26th conference of the parties, the big United Nations negotiations meeting. Is our government, once this offer we've received has been converted into terms and conditions, is our government going to allocate a substantial portion of that to climate change adaptation projects, so projects to make our communities safer? Or will it all be directed towards the transition to away out of fossil fuels? That's also important. But we need to allocate some of our resources to making ourselves more resilient to these extreme events that will just occur more and more frequently because of climate change.
Well, you raised some very important strategic questions, really, for things we need to keep an eye out for. Thank you so much for that. That's Professor Francois Engelbrecht. He's the director at the Global Change Institute at Wits University. Thanks for your time this evening.